This is the Meaning Code, where we look for the metaphors that reveal the hidden reality. And today, Michael's back again, and we're going to be talking about possible topics for the future. So if there's anyone out there who has a topic that they'd like us to talk about, just put that in the comments. Be sure to subscribe. And Michael and I are going to discuss things that we've been thinking about that might turn into topics for future conversations. So I'll let you go first, Michael.
Well, I'm still stuck on the Barfield thread as ever.
Well, that's good. I mean, there's a lot that I would still like to talk about there, but I kind of thought you had wandered off of that into Sokolov or whatever his name is.
Well, one of the big things with Barfield too, in this book, I'm reading about him, is that he's influenced by language and some of his studies on words, but he also, I guess there's a famous French anthropologist. I wasn't really, the name sounded familiar, but I wasn't really familiar with his work. I think it's Levy Bruhl.
Mm-hmm.
Is this guy's name? Have you heard of him before?
Somewhere the name came up, but I can't remember where.
But anyway, he did his own sort of writings on primitive societies, like basically going around and trying to explore and observe the ways in which they conceptualize the worlds they live in. And he tried to take them on their own terms versus he felt that, similar to how Barfield makes the point that when we read old, into history, we kind of anachronistically put our own concepts in our consciousness. We read it into those guys, and we think that they were trying to do the same sorts of things. Like this guy kind of had the same sort of observation in terms of how we understand these primitive societies and how they conceive of the world. And so it was, in his work, there was a whole nother body of evidence towards Barfield's idea of the evolution of consciousness, which I found to be interesting. It's kind of another bolstering element to his claim.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of interesting stuff there, I think, because it's not, a lot of people look at these primitive societies or whatever and think, that they're operating illogically, like that they've just completely gotten rid of logic. And that's not really the case. They are operating, they understand how logic works and like that, but it's in terms of its total impact on how they move around the world, it plays a smaller role. Like, it doesn't play the large scale role that it does in our, modern rationalism that we think is really, the enlightened way to conceive of the world. And that's sort of interesting to think about. Just that, that you have all these parts of you that are aware of things that you can't necessarily put into a propositional mode of communication, but it's still really important, and especially in these, for these, primitive societies, they don't have all the luxuries we have to survive. And so the fact that they even managed to push this far into the modern era with all these, competing civilizations around them and everything, and that they didn't get sucked into those, means they did something interesting, to resist that. They must, their own sort of culture must have had a strong enough pull that they were able to stay together in sort of this alternate mode of being, which is kind of, I don't know. I found that it's terribly fascinating. Why didn't they get subsumed in all the larger civilizing efforts going on? I'm sure there's reasons of geography and other things like that probably played a big role, but also there had to be something of a sort of cultural pull to the way they were living life that they experienced as superior to the other options that they may have had some contact with.
Now that would be an interesting thing to explore, right? What could possibly be superior? What could be preferable? That would be an interesting idea. I think one of the things I've been thinking about is this whole issue of truth.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it fits into what you were just saying is that, and maybe nobody else's consciousness is like mine, I don't know, maybe it is, but for me, whenever I'm trying to actually get at something, when I'm trying to speak truth into some situation, I find this immense resistance all around me. It's almost like I feel like I'm pushing into a fog or a pea soup or something, where, especially if there's something that I want to say that, first of all, I haven't quite got it dialed in, so I haven't quite figured it out yet. So there's a certain fear there that if I try to say this thing, I'm going to come across sounding partly put together or stupid or something.
Right.
But also, there, if I think it's going to be the least bit controversial to the other person, before I even begin to say it, I'm already flashing up into my brain all the possible resistance that they're going to have to it. All of the arguments that they're thinking about are immediately apparent to me in my mind. And then I fall into, and also this thing might be a heretical idea, or it might be an idea that is, you know, insufficiently woke, or that is going to cause offense to somebody. And so everything that I want to say that's complicated or difficult, I face this wall in front of me. And I'm assuming that other people have something of that same kind of experience, maybe not all the time, and maybe not as massive as the wall is in front of me, but I think that there is some resistance to truth that's out in front of us all the time. And the reason that's important is that truth has this, actual truth has this capacity to create order out of chaos, to make something of the future. And if it can be spoken, it has a manifestly good effect on the future. And if it can't be spoken, it has a manifestly bad effect on the future. And where I kind of get, here's where I get confused. Well, I have a lot of places I get confused, but there's one person in particular who's very important to me, with whom I have many conversations about the reality of God and about the truth of Scripture and so forth. And this person is no longer interested in these things. And this person always comes to this statement, well, how can anyone know anything? You know, you can say what you want, that the Bible says this or that God did that, but how can anyone really know anything anyway? Which is, you know, that's the postmodern argument, I guess. So that's one aspect of saying that there is no such thing as true truth, that all truth is relative, that maybe truth is not knowable. But what I find is that this reluctance to accept the reality of truth also over on the scientific side, because I've had this discussion with Carl many times that you can't know ultimate truth, and that he sees that as a good thing, because that means that that scientists will always keep striving for more and more and more, going higher and higher and higher, because they can't get to the truth.
Right.
I understand that, and I actually agree with that, from the standpoint that, I mean, in my worldview, I see Jesus as being the ultimate truth. So we can never get to Jesus. It's this thing like Chris Wilson always talked about with the asymptote. We're always drawing closer, 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 but we can never get there. So in that sense, we can never get to ultimate truth. And yet there has to be something that we can get to that we call truth in our world, or we just can't move forward. And I don't know how to talk to this person I love and give them a basement, to give them a starting presupposition from which they can begin to find some sort of truth so that they can make some sense out of the world.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot in there. In terms of starting places, I think the idea that about one of the things for sure is say that about your own death, something you really know is there. And what I think that's a really important thing to have as part of your building block, part of your frame, because what it means is that you don't have an infinity of time to just pontificate about these things, right? You don't have the luxury of, all right, I'm a really smart person, and these are difficult questions, and I don't feel confident with the results of them, so I'll just kind of have a sort of default do nothing sort of strategy until I figure this out, and that would be a viable strategy, right? If you had eons and eons of time, to kick this around until you settle on something that is, you have confidence in. You have some manner of time left to interact with whatever this gift is that we've been given. And people will argue whether I think that's one of the big questions, or one of the big turning points itself, is just even how you conceptualize the life you've been given. Do you conceptualize it as a gift, or is it this onerous burden that has been, you've been cursed with, which are two different ways of conceptualizing your own being that really makes a difference which one you choose.
Okay, so this person sees it as an onerous burden, not as a gift. So that's got, so whatever my response is, it's got to tackle that problem too.
Yeah.
Because I definitely see life as a gift.
Yeah. I do too. This all comes down to how you conceptualize suffering, and it's such a hard thing, because I can't really philosophically, I can't really speak very intelligently to other people's suffering, because I don't know it, right? I can't experience it. But it's weird. When I had this, because my life's been a little bit stressful lately, and so I've had moments where I've kind of been in kind of this feeling of being in a sort of crucible of suffering, let's say, and I just had this realization recently that there's something something fundamentally good in the suffering, in that, for me specifically, I can tell what it is. It's this sort of pressure that's trying to push out of me things that I already have, from my own lips would say, these are things that I would like to get out of me. I don't like these parts of me. And I can see that. Now, again, that's not something philosophically relevant to everybody, but I feel like in the moments where I'm most willing to be honest with myself, I can tell that suffering is directly related to aspects of my being that I'm holding on to that I probably shouldn't, or like I don't like. And again, by my own value judgment, right? By my own sense of like what I would like to be, like who I would like to, like, we talked, I mentioned earlier, you're going to die, right? So what would I want to be most true about my life when I'm dead? And it seems to me that these issues of suffering always somehow have their finger on and so from that perspective, I can see the good in them, because I can see that they're putting pressure on the parts of me that need to change, that I badly want to change, but don't have the means or ability within myself to like just man up and do it by force of will.
See, there's another good topic, because I have the exact same problem. There are things in myself that I badly want to change, and yet when it comes right to the sticking point, and I know it takes courage. When you get to the sticking point, it takes courage. I mean, here's just a stupid thing, right? I've gotten into this habit of eating a handful of peanuts every night. Well, it doesn't sound like much of anything, but a handful of peanuts every night has turned into like 15 pounds in the last 3-4 months, because that's the way life works. 150 calories a day adds up to 15 pounds a year. So, I mean, but when every night when it rolls around, every day I say all day long, when I get to that point, I am not going to eat those peanuts. But every night, it just seems like something happens that enables me to just override that earlier programming and just walk right over it and just convince myself, justify myself one way or another, I'm going to do that. And that's just a little thing. But I mean, addiction is like that, where it just has so much power. And I mean, there's other changes in my life. I would very much love to be one of those people who works out really hard and, withstands even terrible heat to go out and work out and all that kind of. I've sort of told myself I'm never going to be that person, because I can't rise above whatever that is required to do that. And even the suffering of aches and pains that result from not being in good condition doesn't drive me to do that thing. So what is it that gets us to man up and do the thing that we know is the important thing to do? There's some sort of watching Jordan Peterson lectures is not the only thing.
Yeah. Well, he does a great job within. I think this is what's made him so attractive, is that every single one of his lectures, he touches on these themes. Like, it doesn't matter. And one of the themes always is, it's that same idea within his self-authoring program of you need to have a heaven that you're going towards and a hell that you're running from. And he does a really good job of, I think, making those sort of abstract, ideas, pulling them into the concrete and showing the way they manifest themselves in the sort of moment by moment decisions we make. I think that's why he's been so powerful. And that whole self-authoring thing, where if you do decide, here's what I don't want to become and here's what I want to become, that becomes really super useful as a diagnostic tool when you're trying to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Which path is this pushing me down? And it's weird. It's like, because it's funny, because it's like, just as you pointed out, you have so many small decisions you make in a day that you don't have the time to even think about them while you're doing them. So you have to the reason you're making that decision today is because you made it yesterday and the day before, and that, most of what you do is completely just a habit.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes hard, especially in sort of your habits of thought, which in some sense, habits of thought end up becoming subconscious because you do them so easily that like you don't need to think about them anymore. And they actually now shape your perception of the world. This is kind of like, Barfield mentions this in terms of like his whole figuration and alpha thinking and beta thinking, that these sorts of things, if you practice a sort of alpha thinking all the time, which is your thoughts about what your way you're processing the world, that actually makes its way into those sort of completely unconscious elements that are presenting your options to you, that the conscious part of you has some ability to make choices on.
Could you say a little bit more about that? So you're saying that if you can keep yourself in the alpha thinking, that actually helps you make better choices?
Well, not per se, but the alpha thinking, what you practice there becomes, it's kind of like, I see it this way, like, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I think maybe you could conceptualize your whole brain as like a kid, like your baby, your infant, you're born, it's completely plastic, right? Meaning it could go in so many different directions. But the longer you live your life, the more you start laying down bits of software, gets laid down into a hardened structure. Like it's hardware now. Like, I mean, you can change it, but it's so painful to change it.
Excuse me.
Bless you. So, and I think, I've certainly experienced that in my own life. I mean, and there's advantages to that, because once something gets into that hardware layer, you do it again without you don't have the same level of effort. So if what you've put down into the hardware is something really good, like an ability to, push through when you have some sort of, negative emotion or, pain or whatever it is, if you've learned, okay, this is actually a good thing and I can push through it, that if you get that into your hardware, you become you can become unstoppable. Of course, you can become unstoppable in bad ways with that too. But there's, I don't know, like I think your whole life you're kind of doing this.
Well,
And often,
so what is the alpha thinking, and how do you do that?
well, I don't,
Is alpha thinking, so I've kind of forgotten what we did about the Barfield thing. So just remind me again, is the alpha thinking the thinking that you do about is it the thinking that you do, or is it the thinking you do about your thought process?
yeah. So it's, the alpha thinking is you thinking about your sense perceptions, like what you being attending to what's coming in your sense perceptions, and just the ways you process it,
That's sort of like being in the now.
I guess I don't see in his ideas of consciousness a sort of moral thing going on. Maybe there is there that I haven't been able to suss out, or some specific. But so there's alpha thinking, and then beta thinking is thinking about thought itself. So thinking about the process that you go through when you do this thinking, which I think that's a lot of what we're doing nowadays. And there's good and bad things about that as well. But I think more of it this way, like everything you do, including your thinking, it has a moral component to it. And this is sort of, it's sort of a heavy weight to pick up that idea, like every little thing. And it's, but I think it's really true. And when you interact with those things in that way, and you say, okay, I'm going to do my best and to turn away from the bad into the good, and that's always going to guide me. That becomes that, whether you're choosing the bad or the good, that's laying itself down into that hardware. It's becoming a part of who you're being in a deep way. Because if you think about it, like what is it? Who are you? You know, we use this idea of a story to kind of sum up a person. And I think that there's something right in that. But the story itself is a sort of data compression of something that's deeper and more fundamental, some sort of deep pattern of relationships and associations that are specific to you, that you've inscribed into you via all these decisions you've made. And again, all the little ones too, that you would say in the moment, like, it doesn't matter. I don't want to consider this choice as a moral choice because that's a heavy burden. I'm going to pretend like in this little arena that doesn't matter. The problem is when you play that game, and I've seen this in my life, those areas just, they blossom into larger areas of your life that get out of control because you're not really, you don't engage with them in a serious way. You know, you don't really apply yourself to the questions. Could you please repeat it? Oh, my phone was going off. Sorry. But yeah, and it just, I think that, I mean, that's really the fundamental question of life is, what do you want? Who do you want to be? And you have this sort of limited time frame to sort that out.
Well, I think that would make a good topic for a longer conversation, because one of the things that I've come to is, this weekend was really, really, really hot here, really hot. Just makes life so difficult when it's really hot. And even that little level of suffering just led me down a bunch of bunny trails of, well, why am I doing this YouTube channel anyway, and who cares? Is there any point to all this, and where is it going anyway? Is there any kind of an end game? Is there any purpose in what we're doing? Is there a way that we can make the topics more, and I don't mean everything has to be practical in the sense of, that you can make clickbait 4 ways to do X, Y, Z, but and here's why it's important, because I think we're at a stage in world history where something big is happening, and where truth and integrity are vital to the future of everything. And I just feel like if I'm going to be doing this, it needs to have some kind of an anchor, some kind of commitment to being willing to speak the truth even into the difficult situations. Because I think a lot of times I avoid some of the difficult topics because I might say something wrong, I might get somebody into trouble. But we're seeing that happen all around us, and meanwhile the whole world is catapulting into this craziness. And I just feel like we all need to stand up and pick up the burden wherever it is, just be honest about what the problems are, and make our conversations useful insofar as they can be, not just cogitation, but actually useful towards some end. I mean, maybe that's being Pollyanna. I mean, since we have a grand total of 150 viewers, it's not like it's going to be world shattering or anything, but I do feel a commitment to the people who watch, that we are oriented towards practical good.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I would like to, even with the Barfield stuff, it seems to me that there's some practical good that could come out of that. Because I mean, let's take the example of the tribal group that's still living within their tribal entity versus adopting the enlightened wonders of civilization, that the rest of the world is living in. Exploring that, it might give us some sort of a key to what changes could we adopt as a civilization that would bring some new life into our civilization that we could learn from people who have been doing it a different way for countless tens of thousands of years. There probably are a lot of things we could learn from them, So Barfield has some idea about what that might be, and Levy Bruhl has some idea about what that might be. I think that, so if we explored that topic from the standpoint of what could we learn from that would help us move into a better future. One of the other, well, is there anything you want to say about that topic before we move on? Because I did have one other topic I thought would be kind of interesting to talk about.
I'll just say that one of the things that got me, I think, initially moved me so far away from faith, and part of what has brought me back has been this idea of it's really about this whole split between God 1 and God 2 that Paul always wants to highlight. And what I realized is that, the sort of faith that I grew up in was really narrowly focused on a very small sliver of life, and that the God that I was worshiping there wasn't like a God of the whole world. It was sort of, I don't know how to explain that, but there was this sort of separation between dimensions of reality. And like, it was like God only cared about this little sliver, and that's where he was active and operative. And everywhere else was kind of, let's call it the devil's playground or something like that. It was this completely separate reality. And I think that's part of what Jordan Peterson's appeal is a kind of joining of those two things together. Again, the idea of the sort of the manifest image and the scientific image, and like these two have kind of gone their separate ways, but they, for anything to make sense, for anything to actually have a correspondence and a correlation with truth, you really need those two things together. Mm-hmm. Right? There's the coherence between those two things is what makes something good, not like a sort of laser exactitude within one domain or another. It's this overall coherence. And and so one of the things that's come out of that for myself is realizing, and this is something I'm kind of having to, it's almost like I'm kind of trying to deprogram myself from a certain way of seeing the world that I can tell is deeply false. And yet it still is, it's so baked into those hardware layers we were talking about that I don't realize how much it influences me. But for instance, in terms of like the suffering or things that I've gone through recently, and it became really painfully obvious to me. I'm like, okay, God is speaking to me in all this. Like that God's interaction isn't just in the Bible or in a book on Barfield or in a conversation with you, or, these other moments that I choose to like, dial into some sort of spiritual significance where I turn on my spiritual meter and now I'm like in the spiritual things mode, right? That God as a God of the whole world, a God number one as well, he's deeply involved in speaking to me, even through situations where it's like, maybe it's even my enemy, right? Where I perceive this as my enemy, even if it's, let's concede that maybe even this is the work of the devil, that, there's something satanic afoot that's attacking me. I have, visions of a grandeur that I'm so important that I'm going to be attacked by the devil. Well, let's even concede that God is speaking to and working in me through that as well. And that sort of inclusiveness is not a part of my default mode of being or mentality of being able to have that sort of generosity of spirit to my conception of what God is, what he's doing, what he's capable of, all those things. Like I can spout the platitudes, but actually training my vision and my mental processing of my life, where I have skin in the game, where it's like, like you mentioned courage earlier, where it's my courage that needs to be manifested to just put some sort of virtue on display. That's these situations, these trials are all revealing the truth of who it is that I am right now, and also revealing of like, okay, the path I need to take to get where I want to go. I don't know if that landed well or not, but
Oh no, I totally get what you're talking about. I think where I've gotten off track. I mean there's something not in my hardware that needs to be there for me to make wise peanut decisions. Okay. And that's the thing I've been trying to understand about myself for a long time. What went wrong with my wiring? And probably it has a lot to do with the kind of childhood that I went through. And it also probably has a lot to do with bad decisions that I've made, and relationships that I've had, and the way that I've treated others and been treated in those relationships. I mean, all those things get tied up in there somewhere. But
yep.
I forgot where I was going with this. You just landed the plane and you said, knowing who you are, knowing who God is, because you're learning to see that God is in everything. God is in every aspect of our lives. Everything that happens to us, we can see his hand there. Okay, so I was blessed with becoming a believer in a church that I think manifestly believed that. And the kind of teaching that I got when I was a new believer was very much that keep your eyes open to God sightings. He's all around. He's going to be involved in every situation. There's no tear that is not got value. There's no sorrow. There's no hurt that isn't going to be used for God's glory. There's, that everything that we go through is part of that. But I became a Christian when I was 32 years old. So I had 32 years of programming prior to that where I didn't have that vision at all. And a lot of the hardware that's in me is hardware that was built into me long before I got that vision. And for me, the part that's missing is that I've tried to train myself into. I don't know if you can train yourself into something like that, but to have, so I guess I know the God number 2 picture very much in my life, the personal nature of Christ in my life, and the way he works in my life and all of that. The transcendent God number 1 is the one that I, even from the very beginning, I had to have people teach me how to how to exalt God and how to see him in his transcendence and how to worship him in his glory and in all of his manifest presence and in all of those things. And so, you know, the Bible talks about the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. I think that's one of the pieces that's really missing for me is the fear of God in the very best sense. I don't know if I'm making any sense at all, but if I had that fear of God in a really powerful way in my life, then when you say every decision is a moral decision, I would recognize the absolute truth of that. Every decision is a moral decision because every decision that we make is tied to this issue of how does reality actually work? If I make a decision that goes against reality, it's going to snap back and hit me one way or another. So if I had enough of an absolute belief in the truth of that statement, then I would have a fear of God that would keep me from making decisions that are manifestly bad for me. So either I don't have enough fear of God, or I don't care enough about myself to want to do the things that are good for me instead of bad for me. So I think that might be,
I think
I'm
a
not
lot of
my
times,
therapist.
I think a lot of times, you know, the issue what it boils down to is an issue of patience. It's funny you mentioned fear. When I diagnose a lot of my own issues, I feel like it kind of takes me back to being a child and having a sort of unnatural fear of lots and lots of different things that just kind of manifest itself in all kinds of different ways. But I think part of what's baked into that fear, which is this was sort of paradoxically, and I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I think it's true for me, is a sort of desire to know the truth of things right here and now, to have the meaning and the depth of things and have a sort of shortcut to the answer right now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because the not knowing is the painfulest part of life.
Right. It's easy to commit to a process if you know exactly what you're going to get on the other side of that process. It's difficult when you when you have some doubt, when there's a, you know, you don't, and I think again that the sort of place we've been put in this sort of weird reality is that we don't have that as a luxury. We're kind of, we're in process of something and we don't know what it is, but we have these sort of intuitions about what is good and what is not good. And, you know, and every time we do or choose something along those paths, we learn a little bit more of the story. And so, but there's it's just so funny because, you know, the certain things that we really want and desire often come at the end of a very long process of multiple challenges, hurdles, etc., right? That you overcome to get there. And all along that process, not knowing for certain whether you have the capacity or the capability of getting past all those hurdles. There's a sense in which maybe I've taken on something too much. I'm just gonna fail in the middle of it, and it's gonna all be for nothing. Or that you get to the end of the road and what you thought was there isn't actually there. And so there is this certain courage that is required when you're living in this space of not knowing. That seems like a huge percentage of what it means to be virtuous.
Mm-hmm. Which I guess is when you have to cling to this idea that if you speak the truth, if you live the truth, that whatever happens will be good, even if you can't see that it's good at the moment.
Yeah, and even if it doesn't resound in praise and immediately good things for you,
Yeah.
there can be a deeper good that you in the moment are incapable of perceiving, and yet is still real in moving its way through the course of history, that your sacrifices can make a real impact on, whether you realize it or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes that's sort of the blessing that we have, is that some of the greatness of what we do on the good side is hidden from us. But I think some of the negativity of what we do is hidden from us as well. It allows us to have a little bit more of a lightness in the moment. But I think what you were just referring there to in terms of the fear of God, it's a different kind of fear. It's not a fear of the consequences of what happened to me right now. It's this sort of larger judgment of who you are. Like when you get to the end of your life, and the eulogy that comes in at the end of your life, that sort of summation of who you are, that no human could give an accurate account of, right? But perhaps God could say, yes, this is who Karen was, or this is who Michael was. And this sort of fear of knowing, of wanting that, to have done everything everything you could to resound to the good, and that, and what that account would be, which is, again, it goes very deep into your intentions and your thoughts and your meditations and your desires and fears and all these things that I think sometimes we don't really see as meaningful. We just we in our current frame, we chalk it up to just some sort of unimportant subjective madness that you have to deal with as a human. And really the you think of yourself as your sort of propositional statements about yourself, your job and your balance sheet, and your the number of kids you have, and where they went to school, and all these sort of kind of data points that we summarize ourselves with. We kind of lean towards those things as in our judgments of ourselves, but in others as well. But there's this deeper summation of who you are that that could be represented in God's judgment of who you are.
Well, you mentioned the eulogy, and for several years I used to do the music for funerals, not funerals, but memorial services at our church. So I went to a lot of memorial services for people I'd never met. And it's very interesting what people say about people who've passed away. They never talk about how many children they had or what kind of a job they had, or they never talk about those things. What they talk about is, this person was an anchor in the neighborhood. This person helped everybody. This woman was always making cookies for people. This person was always so loving and caring. That's the kind of thing that people remember. And that's what people get up and talk about at memorial services. And
some of those details by themselves are kind of meaningless, but in the sum, a pattern of these little things is really hugely impactful on communities and relationships and things of that nature. These tiny little things.
Yeah, especially when you see, 50 people come together to celebrate this person's life, and they're willing to get up and talk about what this person meant to them. But on the other side of what you were talking about, I'm wondering if well, I think this is probably true, but in evangelicalism, because there's such an emphasis on God number two, I also feel like a lot of what I'm continually learning and having to unlearn is this idea that you're okay. you know, I mean, I've been in a lot of Bible studies where maybe I'll confess something that I'm struggling with, and somebody in the Bible study will say, "Oh, you're just being too hard on yourself, Jesus accepts you the way you are." And so there's always this kind of reliance of going back and saying, and these are all true things. It's not that they're not true. Jesus is merciful. His mercy is new every morning. But there's not as much emphasis on the other side of that Jesus loves you just the way you are, but he also loves you too much to leave you there, because he knows what you could be. He knows who you actually are, not just who you are right now, stuck in your own patterns, but who you actually are, who you are in potential. And
Yeah.
you
Well,
are.
I think people have come to kind of, repeat that platitude, because there is another real danger, which is that we turn the sort of idea of perfection into its own sort of game, where we.
It's so complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I do this too, because it became, I would say one of the reasons I take on less moral responsibility, right, let's say, than I should, is because of that sort of perfectionism. It's a sort of, I'm not worried about what other people think. I'm really worried about what I'll think relative about what they think, or what, this sort of, yeah, overly critical, sense of what things should or could be. And a deep, again, another, it's a deep lack of patience. Ultimately, which is, like, for instance, if you saw, your toddler trying to walk for the first time, and they get up, take a few steps, and fall over, you're overjoyed with that, right? You're not like, "Oh, you suck at walking," because you understand, as a parent, there's a process that they have to go through, and that's a long process, and it involves a lot of falling down. And so there is a certain encouragement we need towards the day of small beginnings, and the failures, and the getting up and falling down, that we need to be attentive to, because, again, there's a process, not a sort of like binary do or do not do. You did the right thing, you did not do the right thing, kind of thing, governing our lives. And again, in our sort of simplicity of trying to have a sort of easy to measure rubric for ourselves and others, we can become very impatient with our tools that we use to assess ourselves.
Well, I was just listening to Jordan Peterson's biblical lecture number 2 again, and there he goes in this kind of long, or no, maybe it's in his most recent blog post. He's talking about what it takes to teach a child to clean his room.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just lock a 3-year-old in the room and say, "Clean your room," and expect that they'll learn anything. You have to start with, "Do you see that stuffed animal on the floor?" Yes. Okay. Pat them on the head for seeing it, and then pick it up. And then you pat them on the head for picking it up. And then, okay, do you see that shelf over there? And so he said it might take 30 steps before you taught them enough low resolution things about where to put things before they get the idea of what clean your room means.
Mm-hmm.
And even then it's going to take long repeated effort at those things. And that's exactly what we're like in life, which is why I think we keep cycling back around to the same stuff all the time. But hopefully it's like moving up a screw, so that every time you come back around, you're a little bit higher on the screw than you were last time.
Right.
So you're never, running smack dab into where you were before. Maybe you're just a little bit beyond where you were before, but you have to keep tackling the same weaknesses, the same problems. And I have to say, even for myself, that's true. A handful of peanuts definitely beats a whole package of Oreo cookies, which is where I used to be at. So I've made some progress.
Yeah.
Well, so the other topic that I've been thinking about is, I don't know if you ever saw this interview I did with Cy Gart. This would be back in the early days of the Meaning Code. He's a biochemist.
Okay.
And he had just written a book called The Works of His Hands, which is the story of his going from atheism to Christianity. He became a Christian when he was probably 50, maybe.
Oh, wow.
So he grew up in a very atheistic home and became a scientist and was very much an atheist. But it was actually through his work in biochemistry that he eventually came to the Lord, because he saw so much wonder in his work in biochemistry that he just found no place for it. So that was eventually what brought him to faith. But he recently made a video with a young guy, and he was talking about a new argument that he's developing for God's supernatural intervention in the creative process.
Interesting.
And his argument is a very simple argument. It's probably something you've thought of before. It blows my mind that other scientists haven't thought of this, because it seems so obvious. But he started out by saying, suppose a visitor comes to your home and they walk around your home and they say, wow, I love your home. I love everything about your home. I love absolutely every single thing that's in your home. And not only that, I love the exact location of everything that's in your home, right down to all the clothes that are hanging in your closet, and every shoe and every speck of dust on the window blinds. And I want the exact same home. So could you replicate this home for me? So he says that would be very difficult, right? But it's theoretically possible. You could do it. But that you could only do it because you are a thinking being with agency and with consciousness and with resources. But you have exactly the same problem when you think about the very first living cell, because a living cell is incredibly complex.
Yep.
And every living cell has a self-replicating feature, and it can replicate its cell to within 0.00001 error. And it has to be that perfect, otherwise life would not exist. And if the very first cell could not replicate itself, it would have been the last cell. Mm-hmm. So this self-replicating process had to be there from the beginning.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing to me about evolution and the first cell is, think about this, like that first cell, how many times did there have to be a first cell that came together that didn't have the ability to replicate itself? And then it would have to have had been billions and billions and billions of times. And then finally you get the one cell that comes together in a living configuration and has this extra, magical replication capability. I mean,
but the whole idea of evolution is that advance in capability is only because it's continuing, it's a continuous process. If there is no continuous process, how can there be any advance in capability?
Right. Well, and as you pointed out, the just even a single cell is incredibly complicated, incredibly complicated. So that you until you get to the point where you have this sort of replication, you have no ability to kind of like, let's say, kind of save your progress, right?
Yeah.
That's the only point at which you have a save. And so it doesn't matter how close you got to getting to the living configuration or even surpassing it if you don't have that little feature function. Now, I know some people try to get around that by saying, well, the very first thing was just this DNA by itself. Just replicating away, no sort of connection like we have today towards, the encoding of proteins and all the information, just DNA by itself, just replicating. And then somehow this cell kind of coheres around it, and this DNA comes to mean things about I have not seen anything compelling ever about how that process could, where I could see it kind of stepwise where, okay, I could see how you could get to this level. Okay. And then to that level, and to that level, and that level. There's nothing. It's just this sort of leap of infinity where this super improbable event happens. And we just like, well, if you got lots of, stuff, there's a chance it could happen. So it must have happened. It's amazing to me that there's
that video of DNA unzipping and replicating itself. Oh my goodness. I'm going to have to dig that up and bring it on, because once you watch that, that's that argument that you heard about it's just DNA. It's got to be the stupidest thing in the world. It's so incredibly complicated the way every DNA unzips itself so that it can replicate. And when it replicates, one side of the zipper replicates in order. The other side of the zipper, it has to replicate itself backwards. So one side is replicating A, B, C, D, and the other side is replicating Z, W, X, or Z, Y, X, W. I can't even with a consciousness, I can't do it. So yeah, I don't know how much we could plumb out of a topic like that, but I do think that there's something to be said there to think about. I know there are big debates between Christians who believe that evolution was the path that God used to create, and there are Christians who believe that God just did a special creation that did not utilize evolution. And I've always found it kind of interesting that Esther O'Reilly is one of those people that doesn't buy into the whole evolutionary path, but I don't know exactly what path she is looking at. But she's an incredible intellect, so.
Well, there's all sorts of different ways to conceptualize it. Like, I mean, we all know evolution happens in a certain sense that because, like,
or microevolution is without question.
Well, yeah, or even just like when your kids are going to have some of your DNA and some of your husband's DNA, and there's some so there's this combination and remixing of the stuff all the time that's ultimately selecting for certain things based on whether that progeny is able to go out in the world and survive and also replicate itself, right? So that we know that's going on. I think so for some people the question is, the big drawing line for I think most people in terms of the religious frame of investigating this is whether one species could evolve into another species. And I don't. It's hard to investigate these issues because they have such a sort of, I don't know. I would love to have more time to investigate them more seriously, and see what the arguments are. I mean, I know that there's a lot of really smart people who think it's like, well, it's just obvious, you know. Even people that, you know, were skeptical at some point in their life, that, you know, that there is this traceability of, you know, everything back to some sort of ancestor based on genetic code. But one of the things I've thought about recently is, like, I don't know why this occurred to me, but it does seem like this comes back to that issue of patience, that God is very patient, and that what the things he's doing are on these very considerable timelines, that there's a huge amount of planning, effort, consideration, process that's gone into where we are now. And, you know, I think some people can look at a certain evolutionary history and come away with this sort of like, well, what, that's so wasteful. It's just this, why wouldn't a good God just be like, zap, we're to the 21st century and we have iPhones and everything else. Why, what's going on there? But I think another way to think about that is there's a certain dedication and commitment that I think is demonstrated in that long process that might be more important than we're giving it, you know, credit for. I don't know, is one way I think about it. You know, and if you thought about, like, if you are going to be the creator and were tasked with coming up with and creating the best possible universe, you know, of all possible universes, I don't think we take seriously how complicated a task that would be. And what, you know, you just think about it from an informational processing point of view. What sort of computational considerations would be at play to sort through those possibilities? And I've even thought, well, what if, you know, you take like the many worlds hypothesis. What if we are sort of living in this world where, you know, God is in some sense going through and simulating all the different possibilities, and we will arrive in the one that is the best of all possible worlds, you know. And I know that's a heretical idea, and I don't know, people will spin their wheels with that. But I think whatever the nature of how God chose to solve that problem, it's way stranger and more complicated and nuanced than we have bandwidth to take on. That's table stakes for having a conversation on the subject. But I don't know. I think there's something of God's signature in terms of this very long process of his own dedication and self-sacrifice.
Well, I also wonder if it would be good for us to have somebody join us who has some theological background, because I think one of the problems that you run into is when you start thinking about this idea of God's incredible patience, and you run into the idea of potential. And I think there are some heretical ideas wrapped around the distinction between whether God is or whether God is becoming, and whether the universe is or whether the universe is becoming.
My personal opinion on that is there has to be some element of becoming. And the reason I say that is because if there isn't, then God really has no skin in the game. And I think he does. I think that's what the cross is intended to elucidate to us.
Well, so what's the connection between becoming and skin in the game?
Well, I mean, becoming is there's something of God's essential nature and essence that's actually invested in what's going on here, versus he just had some sort of, Legos he put together, and now he's playing with those Legos.
Okay, but that's different than saying that what you're saying is that God is integral to the universe, that he's pouring out something of himself, continually pouring out something of himself into the universe.
Right.
But I think that's different than saying that God is changing in nature. Because the scripture says that he's unchanging, that he never changes. So even if he is pouring something of himself into the universe, I was maybe it was in that thing you sent me on entropy. It was talking about sunlight being that which adds order. Did you need to talk to somebody?
She just came in and stole my lunch.
That's okay. I see this object moving into the frame and then moving out.
That's what I noticed as well.
So anyway, I think that's different than saying that God is changing. Yes, he could be pouring himself into the universe in the same way that sunlight pours itself into the universe or into our world, so that order can be established rather than just constant increasing entropy. Sunlight is helping us move the other direction. So God is pouring his energy into the universe always, pouring his being into the universe, and the universe has changed. But I don't think that necessarily means that God is changing or becoming.
Well, the reason, again, so let's say, okay, there's again, within a universe of our side, there's like this infinity of possibilities for how this universe that we're in could configure itself. We can imagine probably most of those configurations lead to some sort of catastrophe of epic proportions, right? And some of them lead to something that's good of epic proportions, right? And now let's conceive of God as, just to oversimplify things, we'll say that God could be represented by some sort of computational structure of infinite size, that you could conceive of as this long series of ones and zeros in a certain configuration that represents goodness per se. If God creates a universe and that configuration, that computational structure for who he is the same in all, depending on how all those computational systems work themselves out, in the very good ones and the very bad ones, then I would say God has no skin in the game. I mean, he's precisely to the last 0 and 1 the same thing, if it goes down one of these routes or if it goes down one of these routes. I don't think that's true. I think, and so I stick with, I think, there's a correctness in the unchanging element of God. But I don't think that is to say that God is he's the exact same throughout all eternity, down to the last 1 and 0. There's no variance. There's nothing that moves within his being.
Yeah, so there's a difference between saying that he's unchanging and saying that he's static, right? There's a difference. Because he can be the same yesterday and today and forever based on the nature of his being and the nature of his character, and still have.
But again, what's important to me in this is what does he lose in the situation where things go really off the rails? if he doesn't lose something of tangible worth to himself, then he had no skin in the game. And I think there's something of the cross is intended to show the nature of God's work in creation, of what goodness takes in terms of its self-sacrificial qualities. And I don't know what that means. I don't know how to conceive of what God could have in terms of his own investment and what he could be putting on the table that he could lose, or that could, affect him in some negative way. I don't know. I don't understand that, but I do think there's a complexity there, but is hidden from us partially because we tend to read the text in a sort of literal way. We try and read a sort of modern, rational, approach to thinking that we could come up with a systematic orthodoxy that's representative of who God is, which I don't think is. The Bible was never written for that purpose, to help us in the modern frame come up with some sort of system of thought that is completely right, or the right answer. I think it's good that theologians work to create these systems, and they're kind of serve as sort of guideposts and help you know when you're getting off into left field, but they shouldn't be thought to be a box that God lives in.
And I think there's also this fear that we have of saying something that might be wrong. So we avoid looking at some things because, for example, one of the ways that the Bible teaches us to think about God is as a father. So we know that in some sense, he has this image of a parent. And so we can look at the experience of parenthood and say we can learn something about God's sacrifice through the lens of looking at what a parent sacrifices for their child. Mm-hmm. And I was having an episode this weekend of thinking about something in one of my children that is that brings me some sadness. and thinking, now for me as a human, I was looking back with some regret, thinking, where were the mistakes? Where were the things that I neglected to do, or the things that I did that may have led to this problem? And going down that path, of course, doesn't lead to any good result except for a lot of regret, which is completely useless. So then you train your mind and you think forward. Okay, so God is not filled with regret about any of his mistakes because he hasn't made mistakes, but I do think that God is always looking forward for each one of us with what can help to rebuild, what can help to restore the years that the locusts have eaten, or what can help to rebuild the problems that are continually reoccurring, what can help to overcome this continued area of weakness or, structural inability. And as a parent, when I start thinking about that, I automatically think the changes have to come in me. Mm-hmm. I can't impose any change on this other person. I'm the one who has to change. So I can seek God for the areas that need to change in me that would help me to love better, that would help me to listen better, that would help me to encourage better, that would help me to behave in a way that is a better model. There's probably a half a dozen other things I'm not thinking of, but I'm the one who has to change, which means it's a there's some sacrifice on my part. If I want to see a good outcome here, the sacrifice has to come on my part. Now, when we talk about God as a parent, obviously we're not saying that he has to make changes, I mean, I'm not saying that he has any of those problems, but it seems unquestionable to me that every time he's looking at helping any of us move forward, that there is sacrifice on his part for making that happen. There's either some energy going into that or some emptying of himself more, or something that is making that forward movement. So yes, I mean, skin in the game, absolutely. Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, I don't know that I have a good conception of all this, but and I don't presuppose to say that I'm putting something forward that's even novel or that interesting, just to say that I don't find the kind of neat and tidy descriptions of this satisfying. I feel like they may be hiding more than they're revealing who God is.
Well, let me throw a quote at you that I ran into today that might give us a framework for talking about this in the future, and we can use this to wrap up.
Okay.
Because I don't quite understand this quote, but maybe you would understand it. I do think it applies here. This is from The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. And I'm for those who have this book, I'm on page 201. He's talking about union and division and the tendency of the left hemisphere to divide into smaller and smaller pieces, and of the right hemisphere to move towards union and unity. He says, similarly, there are tensions between the rational pursuit of certainty and the desire for knowledge. Since, as Hegel pointed out, immediacy, which is the quality of being understandable without the need for any other concept or idea, immediacy is not compatible with determinacy, and hence certainty is purchased at the expense of content. The more certain our knowledge, the less we know. The more we pinpoint something to be certain of it, the less we actually know of it, which is the equivalent of the uncertainty principle referred to above.
That's interesting.
Does that make any sense to you?
Well, yeah, I think it. I think his definition of certainty there is certainly it's a sort of left brain phenomenon, right? Of the way I think of this is the things we can be certain of in that mode, that like the higher you go up in certainty, the more trivial it is the thing that you're certain of in a certain sense. Like let's say at the like 100% certainty, right? What you really have is a sort of formal system that you've created that's, out of your own imagination, that you know all the ins and outs of, and that okay, I'm absolutely certain that within this construct I go down this binary decision tree and I'm absolutely certain this is the right answer. But I can be 100% certain of that because that formal system is completely my construction. So the fact that I'm certain of it is pretty trivial in terms of its relation to the larger world. And you could say, a level above this would be in mathematics, and not to say that math is trivial, because there's lots of interesting things that it shows us about the world, but it is I don't know, there's a lot of we have this real certainty about certain things in mathematics. However, in a certain sense, they're trivial because it's a self-referential system, right? It does map well onto other parts of reality. So I'm not going to say it's not without value, but it doesn't really map well onto the things that we care most about, right? Like I've never seen anything like a sort of mathematical formula for, what's the right thing to do if your kid has cancer and there's a new experimental, drug that's come out that could either kill the kid or potentially save its life. Like, what do you do? There's, where's the math formula for figuring that out? And so there's this sort of in our desires to move towards more certainty, it seems like we've moved towards these sort of vicious fights about ever more trivial things, like weird categories of thought and speech and labels and things that, they play really well because you can, you can take a very small micro segment of time and do an analysis of it with quote unquote certainty, because you have this sort of, rigorous structure whereby something becomes good or bad, but it has no real bearing on what we know of the complexities of a real human individual, and all the good and bad that is present in both our heroes and our villains.
Yeah, and I can see a lot of overlap with that and the whole idea of intersectionality as well, because that's kind of like the mirror image of that certainty. When you break things down to that fine a point, you've actually broken it down all the way down to the individual, and you've lost the group content. Well, hey, this sounds like a good place to stop for right now, but do you want to, I know your life is incredibly crazy, but when you get a moment, just jot down a few ideas that might have come out of this that would make topics for the future, and I'll try to do the same, and we'll see what we can come up with.
Sounds like a plan.
I hope your life gets a little less stressful.
Me too.
I'm super thankful that we have air conditioning today. That's all I can say. Have a good week, Michael.
Talking to you here.
Bye.
Bye.